Hello again, and welcome back to FSD TV. I'm your host, Mark Sonny, and back with us today we have Kim Bass, who's continuing with the exciting story of Pax. And today we're going to start off with Chapter 14, find out what's going on with Peter's broken foot, and in Chapter 15, what's been going on with Pax and Gray. Take it away, Kim.
Hi everyone, I'm back. This is Mrs. Bass here reading Pax. And we left off last time, if you remember, Gage, with Runt taking guard over Pax while Pax ate after him eating all those eggs. So we're on to Peter's chapter 14. Here we go. Peter recognized Vola's steps, the hard wooden stamp followed by the softer shoed footfall, and dropped the logs back into the wood bin. He braced himself in the cabin doorway, watching Vola pump water into the kitchen sink. "You stayed off that foot?" "Pretty much." Actually, he'd gotten up at least a dozen times to do pull-ups on a beam, and he lifted logs for a half an hour. His arms were sore, and his foot hurt a lot when it wasn't raised. But he hadn't been able to lie around doing nothing, knowing Pax was still out there. Vola began lathering up her hands without turning around. "You write that note?" Peter pulled the crutches to his sides. Already he felt more secure when they were tucked under his arms. "I did, but..." "No buts. You write once a week. The bus driver friend I told you about, Robert Johnson, I ask him. He'll mail them from different spots along his route. First condition, remember?" Peter tried a sharp turn, wobbled, but righted himself. He swung through another turn, smoother. "All right. Okay. Good." Vola hung the dish towel on its peg, crossed to the fireplace, and began shredding newspaper onto the grate. "Let's move to the second condition, then. That charm bracelet you carry. I'm guessing it was your mother's. Why do you carry it with you? Why that particular thing?" Peter felt his body go instantly rigid, the way it always did when anyone asked about his mother, as if it had to freeze to decide whether it was okay to talk about her or not. Usually with strangers, it wasn't. So he was surprised when his hands relaxed their grip on the crutches a little and his throat eased open. "She always wore it. She'd hold her wrist up so I could play with it when I was a baby. I don't remember that, but I've seen a picture. I do remember her telling me about it, though. About the charm, I mean. It's a phoenix. That's a special bird. It's red and gold and purple, colored like sunrise. And it's rises from the ashes. I know what a phoenix is." "Right, but out of its own ashes. That's the part my mom cared about." "Its own ashes?" "When it gets worn out, it builds itself a nest high in a tree away from everything." Peter stopped. It suddenly occurred to him that Vola's cabin felt like a nest. He circled on the crutches to look around. Yes, a secret protected nest surrounded by trees, away from everything. He turned back to Vola, who was cross-stacking kindling. He hoped she hadn't read his mind. "So the phoenix fills the nest with its favorite stuff, myrrh and cinnamon. It's what's in the story, I think. Then the nest ignites, burning the bird's old body, and the new bird rises up out of the old bird's ashes. My mother loved that. She said it meant that no matter how bad things got, we could always make ourselves new again." Vola didn't respond. She touched a match to the shredded paper and watched as it caught fire. Her face looked grim in the light of the new flames. She added 2 logs and then a third. "Go on, try those crutches outside while there's still some light," she said without looking up. Peter opened the front door and navigated the step, relieved to get away. He didn't have a clue what he'd said wrong. Living in the woods all alone probably made a person weird. But she was right that he needed to practice outside. He'd lost a whole day now, a whole day. Maybe he did need some time to train and heal, but he was leaving as soon as he could. He left the cleared yard and headed to where the uneven ground was snarled with roots and brush. It took a torturously long time to circle the cabin. His second turnaround was a little faster, and by the 5th circuit he felt almost comfortable, but he was bathed in sweat when he swung back inside. The cabin was quite quiet except for the gentle crackling of the fire. Vola sat in an armchair, sewing something yellow. The quiet and the way the setting sun seemed to wash the cabin in peace, as if everything were right with the world, suddenly felt mocking to Peter. Everything was wrong with the world. Another day had passed when Pax had been out there alone. Another night was coming when he would be cold, probably hungry and scared too. And what if he hadn't found water? He took a lurching swing across the room. Halfway across, one crutch caught on a rug, and he had to stab the other into the wall to keep from crashing into a lantern. Shorter steps. You'll get the hang of them after a while. After a while? My fox will be dead in a while. He dropped the crutches and sank to the chair at the kitchen table. What's the point anyway? How is this supposed to work out? Vola dropped her sewing. What do I look like? A magic 8-ball? She went out to the porch and came back with a bag of ice. Then she lifted Peter's foot to a chair and arranged the ice over it. I don't have your answers. The sight of his useless foot reminded him of everything he couldn't do now. He looked away. Why not? Aren't you supposed to be wise and all, living out here by yourself with your, what are all these? He threw his thumb toward the jumble of notes tacked onto the board behind him. All these philosophy bingo cards? You're supposed to be wise at least, aren't you? Or witchy or something. Peter almost didn't recognize himself, back talking the woman like this. He felt as if he were short-circuiting, as if his impulses were leaping directly out of him without passing through his brain. But once again, he wasn't where he should be, and now his foot was too wrecked to get him there, and Pax was still out there alone. Vola pulled a bucket out from a cupboard and set it in the sink. Philosophy bingo cards. She looked only mildly insulted. I'm trying to figure out my own life. I don't have your answers. So who does? And don't say my father, because he's a little absent these days, and because he caused all this. Peter hardened his jaw against saying the words and forced himself to breathe slowly. He wasn't angry. He was just frustrated. Anyone would be. Sudden tears threatened. What was wrong with him lately? And he knuckled his eyes. Vola started over toward him and then seemed to change her mind. She backed away to lean against the kitchen counter. You are angry, she said simply, as if she were noting he had dark hair or the sun was going down. I'm not angry. But he forced his fist open and counted 10 slow breaths, fighting it the way he always did. Because what if he was like his father, with that threatening kind of anger, the kind that was always simmering, the kind that could boil over at any time and hurt everyone in the way. The apologies afterward never healed the damage. He squeezed his eyes shut again, the tears still crowning. I'm not angry, it's just that I didn't choose it. I didn't choose for there to be a war. I didn't choose for my father to join up. I didn't choose to leave my home. I didn't choose to go to my grandfather's, and I sure didn't choose to abandon an animal I took care of for 5 years. You're a kid. You don't get a lot of choices. I'd be angry too. Diable man angry. I told you I'm not angry. Peter gulped in a sob that somehow escaped in a twisted laugh. He was short-circuiting again. And you're in love with that word, you know. What are you talking about, boy? Diable man? What is it, a swear? You're in love with that diable man. His wiring felt totally fried. If we were in 2nd grade, I'd tell you you're so in love with that word you should marry it. She squawked, a loud crow's caw. But you're right, she said. I should get down on one diable man ruined knee and ask that word to marry me. You should, Peter agreed, kind of hysterical now. You should put a diable man ring on its diable man finger. He wiped his face off and watched Vola as she came over and took a seat across from him. My grandfather swore in his first language. It drove my grandmother crazy because she couldn't speak it. But she sang in Italian when she cooked. So, Vola lifted a finger to stroke the feathers bunched at her throat. I carry many traits, she said quietly. And then she went silent for a while, holding his gaze the whole time. In their silence, Peter felt that they were saying something important, something about the long, dark tunnel he felt narrowing around him. I was counting on finding Pax in a week, maybe 10 days. He looked down at his foot. Now, Pax, that's his name? It means peace, you know. Peter knew that. Lots of people had told him. But that's not why I named him. First day I brought him home, I left him for a minute, just a minute, so I could get him some food. When I got back, I couldn't find him. He crawled into my backpack and fallen asleep. It had the word Paxton sewn on the label. I was 7 then, and I figured Paxton, that's a good name. It had an X in it, like Fox, you know. But now what? Now he's all alone because of a war. I let him go because of a war. War, not peace. What's that called? Irony? Whatever. Now it's a terrible name. He'll probably die because of a war. Maybe yes, maybe no. He could survive. It's spring. Plenty of food, I'd think. Peter shook his head. Foxes teach their kids to hunt when they're about 8 weeks old. I found him way before that. He was maybe 2 weeks old, the vet figured. He could run across a dozen mice sitting up on little plates, and he probably couldn't catch them. All he's ever had is...
Sorry.
That's right.
Hold that part. You didn't do anything wrong.
Okay.
iPad crashed.
Oh, okay.
And we thought it'd be us. Uh-oh. Still rolling. So that's good.
Okay.
I don't know. Went blank and it's still rolling. So just read that last sentence. Pick it up from...
Before you yell pet.
Maybe yes,
are you
maybe
in the
no.
middle of it or something? A paragraph?
No.
Yeah, just start from the
I'm
start.
trying to think. Okay.
And just, can you say out loud, we are starting from... Read the first couple sentences.
Okay. We're starting from Peter shook his head. Foxes teach their kids to hunt when they're about 8 weeks old.
Perfect.
Okay.
We'll cut this in.
Okay.
Okay.
Peter shook his head. Foxes teach their kids to hunt when they're about 8 weeks old. I found him way before that. He was maybe 2 weeks old, the vet figured. He could run across a dozen mice sitting up on little plates, and he probably couldn't catch them. All he's ever had is kibble and the scraps I let him swipe. Well, what kind of scraps? Anything he'd find out there? Peter shrugged. He's crazy for peanut butter. He likes hot dogs, loves eggs. No, unless he stumbles into someone's picnic, he'll starve. He'll find water, I figure, and he can probably go a week without food, but after that... Peter dropped his head into his hands. I let it happen. I didn't choose any of it, but I didn't fight it either. I don't know why I didn't fight it. Except, of course, he did know. When his father had first dropped the order about Pax, Peter had steeled himself and said, "No, I won't do it." But his father's eyes had flared with that flash-fire anger, and his fist had jerked up, stopping only at the last split second to knuckle Peter's cheek, in a gesture that carried enough threat to set Pax on a growling alert. Peter's own fist had come up, and the rage he felt at his father had scared him more than the threat itself. He heard his grandfather's words now, "Our apples don't fall far from the trees," and he felt sick and afraid all over again. He dropped his gaze to the worn pine table to hide the shameful headline he felt burning across his face. Vola reached over and cupped the top of his head with both hands. Peter froze. Except for an occasional attaboy shoulder shake from his father, or a casual arm punch from one of his friends, no one had touched him since his mother. Vola paused as though she knew he needed time. Then she pressed down firmly. It was a strange thing to do, but Peter didn't pull away, didn't move a muscle, didn't even draw a breath, because at that moment her strong grip was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. "Well, that's over now," she said, "isn't it?" She rose. "I may not have your answers, boy, but I do know one true thing about you. You need food, a lot of food. You're 12, you slept out in the cold, and you've got a bone to heal. I'm going to set that bone now, then I'm going to start cooking, and you're going to start eating, and neither one of us is going to stop until you say so. Got it?" Peter's belly was suddenly a hollow, snarling crater. "Yes, ma'am, I've got it." Vola rummaged under the sink and drew out a sack of plaster. Peter watched her sift some of it into the bucket, and then pump in some water. Then she brought over the things she'd been sewing. "Foot up." Vola propped a pillow under his knee and worked a quilted sleeve over his leg, like an open toe sock. He recognized the yellow checkered pattern. He glanced into the bedroom to be sure. "You cut up your quilt?" "I can always make another. You need the cushioning." She took another section of quilt and stripped the batting off, then ripped the yellow calico into strips and dunked them into the plaster. "Hold your foot at 90-degree angle." Around and around his foot and ankle, halfway up his shin, she wrapped the strips. When she built a thick boot, she frosted it with more plaster. "Don't move, not even your toes." Vola left for the porch and came back with her arms full. She set 2 iron skillets on the burners, flipped a hunk of butter into each, and turned on the flames. She cracked a couple of eggs into a yellow bowl and started whisking in milk, then cornmeal. A cool breeze, fragrant with turned earth and frying butter, lifted against Peter. He looked at the sturdy cast drying, his foot safe inside now, wrapped in what used to be Vola's quilt. "I'm sorry about how I've been." He tipped his head to her bulletin board. "My philosophy bingo cards?" she said with a nod. "No bet, Peter. Those are just things I figure to be true about the world. The universals. The important ones are the things I figure out to be true about me. I keep them somewhere else, private." "How come?" "How come they're the important ones, or how come they're private?" Peter shrugged. "Either, both." He leaned back, waiting. Vola eyed him as she sawed a slice off of ham joint and forked it into one of the frying pans. She dipped out 3 ladles of batter, poured them sputtering into the other pan, then set the bowl down. "I'm going to tell you a story. When I got out of the service, I didn't remember a single true thing about myself. That's what training does. No more individuals, just pieces they can mold to their machine. I was lost my first day as a civilian. Lost. I went into a grocery store. I stared at all the choices, and I kept wondering, who was I supposed to be buying groceries for? What filled this person's hungry belly? Gumbo or pie? Beans or bread? In the produce aisle, I broke down because I didn't remember a single thing about myself." Vola went quiet then, her eyes closed. "What happened?" Peter nudged after a moment. "What happened?" "In the store. What happened in the store?" "Oh." She turned back to the stove and flipped up Johnny cakes. "Peanut butter." "Peanut butter happened?" Vola tossed her hands into the air. "Peanut butter happened, and I was lucky it did. There I was on the floor of the grocery store, dirty, red and white checkered linoleum. I'll never forget weeping, and I knew I wouldn't get up until I remembered what kind of food I liked." Vola stacked the Johnny cakes on a blue plate, then paused. Peter thought she might be drifting back to the memory of that grocery store floor. He was glad he hadn't seen something like that. A grown woman sobbing on a dirty grocery store floor. A crazy lady with one lost leg. He felt suddenly protective and hoped no one had laughed at her and that she'd gotten herself out okay. "And?" "Oh, and finally I did. I remembered my grandmother telling me that when I first discovered peanut butter sandwiches, I wanted one every day. So I got up from the floor and I bought myself some peanut butter and bread. I filled my cart with peanut butter and bread because I decided I wasn't coming back until I knew for sure something else I'd like to eat, and I was afraid that might be a long time." She added the ham to the plate, slapped on the scoop of applesauce, and brought it over to him along with a white pitcher of maple syrup. "Eat." Peter flooded the plate with syrup and loaded the fork. The cornmeal had a gritty crunch. The ham was smooth and salty against the sweet syrup. It was the best food he could remember eating. "And was it," he asked when he cleaned half the plate, "a long time before you remembered something else?" Vola pressed a finger to the drying cast. "Almost set. Keep still a while longer." She went back to the stove and carved more ham and ladled more batter into the skillet. "It was. People around me, they called it PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder from being in the war, and they were right that I was sick. But I knew it wasn't being in the war exactly. It was that in the war I had forgotten everything that was true about myself. Post-traumatic forgetting who you are disorder. That's what I had. My grandfather was in a nursing home by then, and he was dying. I went out to his place. It had been my old home, too. My grandparents raised me for a couple years to clean it out. It was the end of the summer. The orchard was an untended mess, but there were still some peaches hanging on, and that was the second lucky thing that happened to me after the peanut butter, because I suddenly remembered, Lord, I had loved those peaches. I used to sneak out in the middle of the night to pick them. I'd sprawl on the grass underneath those trees with fireflies flashing all around, and Katie did singing a heap of peaches on my belly, and I'd eat them until the juice ran into my ears. I remembered that so clearly I could smell the memory. I could hear it, and I could taste it. But I couldn't figure out how that girl could be the same person who had put on a uniform, picked up a gun, and done the things I did in the war. So I reached up and picked one of those peaches, and I laid myself down on the grass and bit into it, and there I was. I found another little true piece of my old self. She brought the skillet over and stacked more Johnny cakes and ham onto his empty plate, then went back to the stove. "Stop," Peter said. "Stop. Well, that's the end of the story anyway. No, I mean, this'll be enough food, thank you." Peter wished again that his fox were under the table, wondered again if Pax was hungry, and then had the curious sense that he wasn't, that tonight at least Pax had food in his belly. "So then what?" he asked after loading his fork. "You were okay?" Vola set the skillet in the sink and came back to sit across from him at the table. What a person likes to eat, that's a detail. I was so lost, I needed to find out all the true things about myself, the little things to the biggest of all. What did I believe in at my core? Peter figured he knew what was coming. Like war. Now you're anti-war, right? Vola steepled her fingers under her chin. That's a complicated thing. What I am is for telling the truth about it, about what it costs. People should tell the truth about what war costs. That's taken me a long time to figure out. She leaned back. And that's just one thing. I had to relearn everything that was right and wrong for me. But I couldn't. The world was too loud for me to hear myself think, so I moved into my grandfather's place. I decided to stay there until I knew who I was again. Peter looked up at the jarred peaches on the shelf above him, then recalled the blooming trees in the orchard. "And you're still here," he said. "This is that place, isn't it?" And that ends chapter 14. Well, we're going to start chapter 15 and learn more about what is happening with Pax. Are you ready, Gage? Chapter 15. Here we go. The sun burned through the dawn fog. The two foxes had been traveling for hours, but Gray was slow and rested often, so they had only just reached the valley basin. For the most part, Pax respectfully flanked the older fox, but sometimes he broke away to race at full speed for long, glorious minutes before circling back. He had never run before, not really. He'd sprinted around the borders of his pen or across the yard, but this running was a different thing. Neat oval paws, healed now, skimming the ground only for traction as he galloped faster and faster over great sweeps of grass. Yesterday's meal had cleared his senses and fueled his muscles, but now the eggs were gone from his belly, and the smells of the warming valley brought on a powerful hunger. Where the humans were, there would be food. How far? 2 days' travel. Gray described a place of old stone walls where the earth smelled faintly of tar and hemp, bordered by a river. We will reach it by dusk. The human settlements are another day's travel beyond that. Pax did not remember human settlements. He did not remember a river. Of his home he remembered the looming door. He remembered oaks ringing the house, the overgrown remains of a flower garden he was never allowed into, the sounds of a road. He sensed that other humans lived along this road, but he had never encountered them. These memories were fading, as was the memory of being caged. He could no longer recall what the sky looked like through hexagons of cage wire. He remembered his boy, though. The hazel eyes with their odd round pupils, the way Peter would close them and throw his head back and yelp something near a bark when he was delighted. his salty neck that smelled sometimes of sweat and sometimes of soap, his hands always moving with their scent of chocolate which Pax loved, and a mitt of leather which he loathed. As the two foxes traveled on, Pax reflected on the puzzle of the other sense of his boy, his underlying scent. It hung between grief and yearning, and it welled from a deep ache from something that Pax could never divine. Sometimes in the boy's nest room, this grief-yearning scent was so strong that it overpowered everything else, and yet his boy made no move to acquire whatever it was he wanted so badly. Whenever Pax caught that scent, he would hurry from wherever he was to find Peter flung across his bed, clutching the objects he kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his bureau. His face set in hard ridges. Pax would nose Peter's shirt sleeve or claw up the curtains, then pretend to lose his footing and fall to the floor, anything to get his boy to play. But when the grief-yearning scent was strongest, none of his tricks would work. On those days, Peter would shoo Pax outside and shut the door. Remembering this, Pax felt the urge to run again, but not for the joy of it. This war that is coming, are you sure it will harm all in its path? Even the youth? Everything. It will destroy everything. Pax nosed Gray, respectful but urgent. They must hurry. The older fox studied the younger one for a moment, then began to trot. They crossed the marshy seam of the valley and climbed the rocky cliffs, shoulder to shoulder this time. At the top of the rise, the two foxes stopped. Gray was panting hard. Ahead, the pines towered up, promising long, cool pools of shade. But the markings here were strong. The challenger hunted this territory, and the threat in his scent was unmistakable. And almost immediately the ground beat with the light staccato of paws tearing toward them. Pax and Gray had barely braced themselves when the tawny fox burst from the underbrush, lips curled in a snarl, tail lashing. Pax shrank back, but Gray advanced calmly, his body lowered enough to declare non-aggression. We are only passing through. The challenger ignored the peaceful greeting and sprang, hitting the old fox hard in the flank and pinning him down, and sank his teeth into Gray's thin neck. At Gray's pained scream, Pax's guard hairs lifted and his heartbeat quickened. His muscles thrummed with a fury he'd known only once. In the early days with his humans, the father had raised a hand to the boy, and Pax had shot across the room without thought, small kit teeth tearing fiercely through the man's pant leg. Now, as it had then, his back arched and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. The challenger spun around in surprise, and Pax charged him headlong. They rolled, teeth clipping at tender ears, hind claws digging for perches in soft belly fur. The yellow fox was more skilled, but Pax's fighting was fueled by an instinct to protect. When his teeth found the other's throat, the challenger scrambled to his feet and backed off, whimpering. Pax leaped in front of Gray, shielding him, as he shielded his boy that long time ago, lifted his chest and growled a warning. The challenger slunk away. Pax shook off the blood from a dozen superficial scratches, and then cleaned Gray's wound. The puncture was deep. He urged Gray to go back. No, I will travel. The two padded steadily for an hour through light woods, Pax restraining himself to keep pace with the ailing Gray, relieved at least that they kept moving. But when a murder of crows landed in the bare arms of a pecan tree, Gray doubled back and sat down at its base, ears pricked up intently at the commotion. Pax waited, not patiently. After a moment, the old fox barked for him. The war is moving closer. How do you know this? The crows. Listen. Pax cocked his head. More shrieking birds swept in, descending onto lower branches, then flapping up again to higher perches in a cyclone of distress. They're upset. The crows hulked their shoulders, spiked their feathers, jerked and dipped their shrieking beaks. Their discord set Pax's nerve on edge. There is disorder. He attended more carefully. What he sensed alarmed him. He tried to describe it. Air choked with death, fire and smoke, blood in a river, the river running red with it, the earth drowning in blood, chaos. Everything is broken. The fibers of the trees, the clouds, even the air is broken. Yes, war. Where? Pax attuned himself once more. West, still distant, but nearing, and now a small group of warsick has come from the south to meet it. From the south? Pax paced while Gray struggled to his feet. He offered again to travel alone, and again Gray refused to turn back home. Again they set out, and again their pace was slower than Pax wanted. They stopped only for meals of grubs and berries, and whenever they did, Pax searched the air for any trace of his boy's scent, for the faintest sound of his voice. None. None. He lifted his muzzle and bayed a single aching note. It had been so long since he'd seen his boy. Before this, they'd never been apart for more than a half a day. Often Peter would leave in the morning, and Pax would pace his pen in increasing distress until the afternoon. When Peter would come home, smelling of other young humans and of the strange breath of the large yellow bus that delivered him, with the afternoon Pax could reassure himself his boy was all right, examining him for any sign of injury before he could relax into play. It was afternoon now. He bayed again, and this time Gray lifted his voice in an echo of loss. But when Pax trotted back to the path to resume the journey, Gray faltered. Pax could see that he needed rest. He led the wounded fox to a mossy circle of shade beneath a pine. Gray laid his cheek on his paws, and before Pax had even finished cleaning his wound again, he was asleep. As Pax kept watch, he thought of doing favorite things with his boy when he found him, tumbling together outside, playing hunting games, exploring the grassed yard and the bit of woods behind it. He remembered the ways his boys would reward him, the full smiles of greeting, the thorough neck scratches, Peter's fingers digging in just hard enough. He recalled the peace of lying at his boy's feet in front of the fire. These thoughts calmed Pax as he dozed with the memory of Peter's knuckles kneading the loose skin between his shoulder blades, so real that his fur ruffled under it, until a shifting breeze brought a scent that called him to instant alert. Meat. Roasted meat. The kind as humans sometimes cooked over a fire in the yard. His boy would feed him bites of this meat, dripping with fat. For days afterwards, Pax would scour the ashy firebed for overlooked scraps. Even the charred bones were treasures. Pax got to his paws to sniff more deeply. Yes, roasted meat. He nosed the sleeping Gray. Humans are near. Gray moved more easily after his rest, and the two foxes kept up a loping pace. As they got closer, though, Pax charged ahead. His body was light, the fat burned off from days of scarce food. He ran as foxes are meant to run, compact body arrowing through the air at a swiftness that rippled his fur. The new joy of speed, the urgency of coming night, the hope of reunion with his boy, these things transformed him into something that shot like liquid fire between the trees. Something gravity couldn't touch. Pax could have run forever, until he galloped out from the woods and saw ahead of him a wide circle. Beyond that stretched a clear field, flat and then rising up to massive crumbling stone walls. It was dusk now, and at the far corner of the stone ruins, a dozen men were gathered around a fire, eating. Beyond them were a cluster of tents and several large vehicles. The wind had shifted to the east. The grilled meat smoke still hung heavy in the air, but Pax could only get a general scent of the humans. He bounded up and down the river's edge, frustrated, but from no direction could he differentiate one human scent from another. At least Pax knew his boy was not here. None of the humans had his reedy form. None moved with the same quick energy. None held himself as Peter had, upright, but with a downward cant of his head. He was relieved, the other sense of the encampment. Smoke, diesel, scorched metal, and a strange, dark electric odor were things he could have herded Peter away from. Gray limped from the woods and flopped to the river bank beside Pax. Together the two foxes watched the men. They had finished eating, but they remained around the fire, talking and laughing. They are warsick? Pax wanted to know. Not now. They are peaceful now. I remember this peace. The old fox curled his forelegs under his chest. At the end of the day, the humans I lived with gathered like those across the river. Suddenly Pax remembered. He had seen something similar as well. It hadn't happened for several years, but sometimes at the end of the day, his humans would sit together on his boy's nest. The father would lay a hard box, flat and thin, and made of many layers of paper across his lap. Paper, like Pax's own bedding, but not shredded, and with many marks. His humans would peel these layers one by one and study them. Pax remembered that his humans were most linked together on those evenings, and with their harmony, he could let down his guard. Pax felt a strange sensation, as if his chest were no longer large enough for his heart. The foxes turned back to the men. Some were still crouched around the fire, while others moved with lanterns between the equipment and the tents. With full darkness, the remaining men rose from the fireside. They dumped out mugs of coffee, scuffed dirt over the flames, and ducked into tents. Gray rose along also and limped uphill to the protection of the sweeping hemlock bough. He circled and curled himself up on the pine-needled ground underneath, his nose tucked under his brush. The smell of the meat had made Pax too hungry to rest. He trotted to the edge of the river. Its current was soft. He dipped his head and drank, and then jumped to a rock, slippery with moss but stable. Then, gaze fixed on the glow of the dying embers, he chose. A leap, a splash, and again his body did what it had never done before but was meant to do all along. He swam. A moment later, he climbed the bank and shook himself off. Neither movement nor sound came from the tents. Pax crept silently across the field and climbed the rise. He circled the bounds of the camp, edging closer and closer to the fire. The sense of danger was strong. It was hard not to flee. He was, after all, accustomed only to his two humans, the one he loved, the one he tolerated. Several times he crept into the very rim of the firebed, found a smell of meat laced with a warning scent of the warsick men, then leaped back. A discarded pork bone, still redolent with fat, proved too much to resist. Pax started in. As he gulped the meat, ash gritted, but still warm. The rustle of canvas startled him. He froze. A man emerged from a tent. Silhouetted by lantern light, he stretched, and a long shadow snaked out to cloak the watching fox. The man turned away and relieved himself on a bush. The scent of his urine traveled to Pax, and he bristled to sharp alert. His boy's father. And that ends chapter 15.
Thank you, Kim, for the exciting chapters 14 and 15. And kids, were you surprised that Pax ran into Peter's father? I know I was. We'll find out what happens in our next chapters. On behalf of everyone here at FSD TV Studios, my name is Mark Sonny, and this has been FSD TV.